So this is an enormous subject, obviously, isn't it? Money. It's a huge subject. It touches all our lives every day, except possibly Mark, but we're going to hear more about that later. And when I first started learning about money and talking about money, it's probably about 10 years ago, something like that. A lot of the things I learned were fairly radical, and when I talked about them, people kind of didn't believe me and thought I was a bit mad. And then the financial crisis happened, and that was a wonderful thing, because suddenly all the really strange and radical ways of looking at money started to look like they might be true, and the enormous kind of monolithic system of money that we're all used to revealed itself to actually be very vulnerable. So it's in that context that I'm talking about money, really, post the crisis and also in view of the ecological crisis that we're facing. But obviously, I can't expect to cover everything today, so I've selected a few things I think are the most important things in terms of what we need to know as people involved in transition and in trying to build a sustainable society. And if you kind of get interested in this, I could suggest a few more things to read, and it does get a bit obsessive for a while, I think, when you first start finding out how money works, and no doubt some of you have been on that journey. But yeah, I'm just going to cover some of what I think are the most important things, and then we can certainly go into a discussion with some questions if we've got time for that. Okay, so this is the little bit of me that's like a lecturer now. This is what I would teach if I was teaching students. This is what we teach all first-year economics students, actually. So what is money? The conventional economics definition of money is a functional definition. You define money in terms of what it does, and it's supposed to do these three things. It's supposed to be a medium of exchange. That's to say it's a way of letting us trade things with each other. So, you know, barter is a bit inconvenient, so we have money in order to facilitate these transactions, so you don't have to have exactly the same thing that the other person wants and vice versa. So money is to enable exchange to take place. I think it's very useful in that role. I don't have a problem with it playing that role. I have a problem with the way this money we're working with is designed and basically owned as well. So then money is a measure of value and a unit of account. That's just to say, you know, when you say how much is something worth, you need to measure it in terms of something, and you measure it in terms of your money. That one, I think, is a little bit more problematic, because it does move us fairly quickly into the area where if you can't put a monetary measure on something, then it looks like it doesn't have any value. And although that isn't inevitable, there isn't an inevitable step there, that does tend to happen. And that, I think, is part of the reason we've got into the sort of mess where we're very much focusing on the monetary value of things rather than the sort of social value or the ecological value or even the spiritual value. So I think we should be a little bit more careful about that one. And lastly, we have this fact that money is a store of value. So you tend not to think about that. We tend to take that for granted, that you can earn money at one time and you can sort of save that across time and have a thing later on in time. But if you think about a turnip, you know, that's not going to work. The turnip's going to go off, and then, you know, you have to eat it in a certain amount of time. And money is a very convenient way of holding on to that value through time. And that aspect of money, I think, is a little bit more problematic for reasons I'm going to go into in a minute. Right, so here's an important point. These different roles of money may be incompatible with each other. So to me, as I've already said, the most important function of money is that it acts as a sort of lubrication of an economy. It enables us to do all that sharing and trading and passing things around. That's what an economy is about, I think. But if some people are using it in the store of value function, if some people are using the money to hold it through time so that they can exercise their right to buy things later on, then that may impede the kind of exchange and transaction aspect of money. And more to the point, that's the kind of thing about time, but there's also this thing about space. You know, the money may not be in the place we need it to enable our economy to function properly. It's very often, I mean, money will go to the place where it can earn the most extra money. That if in this kind of capitalist economy where interest is paid on money and you can earn money for holding money, money will tend to wander off to the place where it can make the greatest profit. And that isn't always the thing that's best in terms of human well-being. So the best example is these kind of speculative money circuits where money actually no longer is present in local economies. And the local economies might actually seize up for lack of that lubrication, because that money has gone off to buy some pointless derivative or to be invested in destroying some rainforest in Indonesia or whatever will make a profit. So that ability of money to make money and to be moved through time, I think can be actually something that then conflicts with our ability to have money that will support our local economy. And that's the main justification that's used for creating local currencies, as we're going to hear about later on. Right, thank you. Excellent. Right, I'm going to briefly go through these three myths that kind of challenge the way a lot of people think about money. I'm sure some of you have now thought about this, because this is the great thing about the crisis, that lots of people thought, what the hell's going on? I'd better find out. And I was absolutely amazed by how much information people had picked up from the internet and just learned about money and not believing these old myths. But anyway, I'm just going to go through puncturing the three of them, just because I think it's quite important for anybody who's still left believing these things. People tend to think that there's this fractional reserve process going on. So they know that the money in the bank, they know that when they get money from the bank, that money wasn't necessarily there beforehand. People don't usually believe that somebody's deposited the money they get out of the bank. But they do have this kind of conception that somebody has made some rule about how many more times a bank can lend money relative to the amount of money they've got in the bank. And actually, that hasn't been the case for some years now. There used to be a sort of fractional reserve imposed by governments, and part of the story I'm going to be telling here is about how much political control we the people, through our elected representatives, have over what happens with money. We used to have a lot more than we have now. So the constraints on bank lending is now basically determined by how many people the banks can persuade to borrow that money, which is why up to the point of the crisis, there was like stuff coming at you all the time through your letterbox saying, you know, why not have a new car, or you know, all sorts of ways to try and persuade you basically to borrow money, because that enabled the banks to create that money. But this system, the system of creating money through debt, relies on having this endless number of willing borrowers. And if you run out of borrowers, then the system will collapse. And I think it's right in saying, and it gets to be a little bit sort of vague and so abstract that it's hard to see if this might be so, but it seems to me that it's so that if all debts were paid, we would totally run out of money and our economy would collapse. And that's the nature of a capitalist money system, which seems to me utterly illogical. But that's what happens if you use debt as your way of creating money. So the first thing, if we're asking what do we need to do in order to have a money system for a sustainable society, the answer is we need to create money as credit, as we do with local currencies, rather than creating money in this way based on debt. And so the other important point to realise about that is that the quantity of money out there is not related to economic activity. In a sustainable society, it seems to me it would be sensible that the government would create money in some way relating to how much, you know, people, if it's there to enable the exchange of goods, it would relate to some extent to the amount of goods out there, but that's not the case in our money system. Money can just be created as long as people will borrow it, and so you can have a huge inflation in the amount of money out there, which has all sorts of negative impacts on the real economy, actually. So that's one myth. The second myth is that money is, in some sense, backed by something. People also have some kind of image of a, you know, Fort Knox there, or the Bank of England with loads of gold sitting there, and that, you know, although you can't really go in and take your five or whatever and ask for a teeny bit of gold, you know, in some sense there is something backing our money, and that's also not the case. So money is what they call fiat money, as in fiat lux, let there be light, let there be money. It's created in that kind of way. So banks and governments do now, they do hold some gold, but they're basically not holding enough gold to back the money. That system is no longer in operation. And, well, this kind of came and went and created a lot of instability through the sort of 19th century and into the 20th century. And basically by the end of the Second World War, there was a kind of decision that this money system was very destructive. It led to conflict between nations. And in order to deal with that, so we didn't end up in another war, there was an agreement at Bretton Woods in 1944 that there would now be a new system, that the US would base the dollar on gold, and everybody else would accept the dollar as if it was gold, and they would all link back to the dollar. So there would be some stability in the system. But that led to a lot of problems for the US, because it couldn't now create money at will. And so basically in 1971, Nixon broke that agreement just unilaterally. There wasn't any sort of, you know, big table with guys sitting around. He just said, well, I can't afford the Vietnam War, so I'm no longer going to keep enough gold to back the dollars. I'm just going to start creating the dollars I need to buy weapons. And at that point, the system kind of went into a sort of pattern of expansion, which basically, as I see it, bust in 2007, 2008. So money is not now back. There's nothing kind of holding it back from expanding. It can just kind of expand at will, and that has quite a lot of environmental consequences, as we'll see in a minute.